Stalin, Chapter 7. The Depiction of Stalin Between History and Mythology. Section. The Various Historical Sources in the Current Depiction of Stalin. However, it's difficult for the current historiography to distance itself from the depiction of Stalin as an, quote, enormous, shadowy, capricious, and degenerate monster of a man. In addition, so lacking in intellectual and political capacity that he becomes the object of ridicule. With regard to its mythology, it's also necessary to search for its historical origin. It's worthwhile to start with the author, Deutscher, who was just cited, who, in other circumstances and in a different period of time, observes, quote, in contrast to the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks don't execute their Girondins, namely the Mensheviks, who were permitted, and even, quote, encouraged to leave Russia and set up their political center abroad, end quote. From there, a harsh campaign is developed against the country first led by Lenin and later, for a longer period of time, by Stalin. Deutscher continues as follows, beginning of long quote. It's correct that Stalin meditated at length about the terrible French precedent, and for a few years that dissuaded him from resorting to more drastic means of repression. More than once, Stalin had expressed himself in that sense. In 1929, he decided to exile Trotsky from Russia. One couldn't yet imagine that Trotsky was to be captured, and much less put before an execution squad. End quote. With the opposition leader's arrival in Istanbul, a new and more committed political center is formed, this time dedicated exclusively to exposing and denouncing all aspects of Stalin's personality and actions. Fugitives like General Orlov can be put in that same context. Fugitives who, in reaching the West, dedicate themselves to revealing the, quote, Kremlin secrets, earning an enormous amount of money, and presumably it's a sum that's greater for however much more sensational the revealed secrets are. Beginning with the Gorbachev years, these revelations are eagerly welcomed in the Soviet Union, and are still today, quote, one of the most important sources for Western Sovietology. These revelations, however, are a web of lies. Obviously, we must not overlook the fact that the anti-Stalin campaign has its political center in the West. Its motivations had been previously clarified by Lloyd George, who, in the summer of 1919, observed that a united Russia, whether Bolshevik or not, constituted a threat to the British Empire. In other words, a wide part of public opinion, first British and later American, identify Stalin as the incarnation of a double threat that represented communist agitation in the capitalist metropole, and especially in the colonies, and that represented a great power, now all the more dangerous and expansionist for the fact it inspires and leads a political movement represented in all parts of the world. Which of the different political centers was the most implacable? At times, we get the impression that we are watching a competition. Soon after the Pact of Non-Aggression between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, Trotsky lets out a type of victory cry. Finally, it's now evident to even the, quote, professional apologists for the Kremlin and Stalin, the pro-Soviet fools of all types, those who had the illusion of being able to count on Moscow's support in containing Nazi Germany's expansion. Neville Chamberlain is especially targeted. Yes, the British Prime Minister, who by this time is denounced by Churchill for his policy of appeasement, pursued in relation to Hitler, is sharply criticized by Trotsky for having fed illusions towards Stalin. Quote, despite all his aversions towards the Soviet regime, the British conservative leader had tried to make an alliance with Stalin using all means, end quote. A colossal example of naivete. Trotsky had repeatedly stated since the rise of the Third Reich that, despite all the rhetoric about the anti-fascist popular fronts, quote, the real objective of Stalin's foreign policy was to reach a deal with Hitler, end quote. Now all are forced to recognize that the Kremlin dictator is, quote, Hitler's butler. This competition, seriously weakened by the epic resistance by the Soviet Union against the Third Reich, returns in force after the 20th Congress of the CPSU and the Secret Report. So Khrushchev accused Stalin of having deviated from Lenin. In fact, Orlov immediately increased the dose, publishing an article that in its very title announces a, quote, sensational secret. The man who led the Soviet Union for 30 years was a secret police agent for the Tsarist regime, obviously prepared to liquidate the unlucky souls who learned of his unspeakable past. Still today, a Russian researcher, Rogowin, a zealous follower of Trotsky's, appears to cling to that revelation. The competition can take on the most unique forms. In 1965, Deutscher reflects on the evolution of the Menshevik leader, Dan, who, patriotically blinded by the image of Russia, quote, triumphantly emerging from a catastrophic war, with the Third Reich prostrated before it, end quote, ended up recognizing the historical correctness of the October Revolution, but also, unfortunately, the correctness of, quote, Stalinism, with all its ideological perversions and violence, end quote. There's only one excuse for that tolerance toward a, quote, degenerated and corrupted Bolshevism. The fact that, quote, when Dan wrote some of these pages, the pro-Stalinist tide in the Allied countries was very strong, especially during the immediate post-war period in the United States, end quote. Fortunately, the information coming from the very capital of the Soviet Union, and from within that country's very own Communist Party, refuted and ridiculed once and for all the naive and ill-informed who had in some way or another consumed Moscow's propaganda. Only through this convergence of heterogeneous interests can one explain the paradox of a historiography that, while unceasingly denouncing the farcical nature of the trials carried out by Stalin in Moscow, has easily accepted the legitimacy of the trial conducted in different manners, first by Trotsky and later by Khrushchev. End section.